This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Another tragic day, not only for the United States, but for humanity as a whole. 21 people, including 19 primary school children, were shot dead by an 18-year-old gunman in Texas, United States. Now, talking about these children, they had their whole life ahead of them. And for their parents and their schoolmates and their teachers, they will have to live with this for the rest of their lives. Now, this is senseless and outrageous, of course. But if you remember Sandy Hook primary school shooting that took place in 2012, I was there. 20 primary school kids aged between 5 and 6 were killed. I spent a whole week there interviewing witnesses. I still remember the sense of sadness, the grief, the feeling of doom and gloom. And now here we go again. When is enough really enough?
The parents who will never see their child again.
We have another Sandy Hook on our hands. Nowhere else does that happen except here in the United States of America, and it is a choice. It is our choice to let it continue.
A choice that continues to let people die. In 2022, gun violence continues to be rampant in the United States, causing 242 deaths and 912 injuries. The U.S. ended 2019 with 417 mass shootings. 2020 saw 611. 2021 had 693, and the number is expected to be higher by the end of this year.
The most successful gun violence prevention strategy would be controlling access to firearms. Unfortunately, federal background checks only cover 78% of gun sales, and that's written into our federal law. So you have almost a quarter of gun sales happening legally with no background check.
Even though background checks are not a foolproof solution, they can reduce gun crimes. But in some states, lawmakers are not willing to curb easy access to firearms. Instead, they are removing gun controls.
It is now, today, easier to get a gun than drive a car in Texas. Last year, a new law from Republicans ended licensing, testing, training, or even a local background check.
As the pandemic continues, Americans are buying more guns. Nearly 19 million firearms were sold legally in the U.S. last year. Unfortunately, more guns trigger more crimes, not more safety.
What's behind the repeated mass shootings? Did America's political polarization contribute to this crisis? Now, in the politically charged season, can U.S. politicians come up with any common sense gun control measures? To discuss all this, I'm joined in Washington, D.C. by Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism program at Tsinghua University. This is originally the D.C. bureau chief of the Houston Chronicle. In Baltimore, we have Ray Baker, political commentator and adjunct professor at Towson University. And in LA, we have William Lee, chief economist from the Milken Institute. Welcome, gentlemen. Ray, let me go to you first. Since the beginning of this year, hardly one day goes by in the United States without people being killed or injured in a shooting incident. And how and why did this still happen in the United States?
Quite honestly, the United States speaks through the language of violence. Far too often, the way that we resolve so many of our conflicts have to do with violence, and that violence happens whether we're talking institutionally, those may be agents of the state, or whether we're talking interpersonally, when an individual decides they want to enact their wishes upon another individual or collection of individuals. And so the most effective way to communicate, the way that Americans have observed the history of our country and the way that empires, quite honestly speak, is through violence. Consider the United States and its territorial gains since its founding. It has moved all throughout the modest East Coast Atlantic seaboard in which the original colonies were, through in one way or another, violent diplomacy, whether that violence was with those native indigenous people that were here on what we now call North America, or whether that violence was taken across the globe as the United States acquire possessions and use the people in various places across the globe as a part of their own fundamental empire. And so when we see that nationally, when we see that the political language of the country is violence, we should not be surprised when the individual actors within the country also communicate using that same language.
Yeah, I mean, William, let me go to you. New York governor condemned the mainstreaming of hate speech and easy access to military-style weapons. I mean, we've heard it too often, right, over the past years and decades. Was it too little, too late?
Well, to condemn guns and weapons is really to condemn the instrument. Really, the cause is the thing that we really have to get at. And unlike Ray, I have a much more narrower and micro perspective. I think people start to get violent when they get frustrated. They think the system breaks down, the system doesn't work for them, and there's no other way to express the frustration other than through violence. And I think that is truly a symbol of the breakdown of institutions' ability to work for the people. And I think that's a clear sign of the need for reform. So yes, the governor is late, but it's late not just for calling for arms control or the instruments, controlling the instruments, but she is late in calling for a repair of the social institutions.
Can you elaborate on that? I mean, the social institutions, they cover so much and so many grounds, right?
Absolutely. And let's be specific about that. Right now, we have ended one of the longest expansions in U.S. history. People have been finally getting something in terms of employment. They're getting ahead in life. They're trying to do something for their families. And all of a sudden, COVID comes along, the economy shuts down, and they're back to hand to mouth with stimulus checks. Now we find that the economy itself is overheated, and the institutions that are supposed to preserve economic conditions that maximize income and maximize employment, those institutions are failing, mainly the Federal Reserve and the president's fiscal policies. So because of that inability to serve the people and allow them to slowly gain the footing that they wanted in society by moving ahead, having their children have better lives than they had, that dream seems to be threatened. And I think that is one of the sources of the frustration that has led to the violence, since the institutions themselves seem not to be addressing the problems themselves.
Rick, I mean, one of the perpetrators of a recent gun shooting holds a gun called Bushmaster XM15. And the shop owner who sold this perpetrator the gun said they ran a background check on him, but nothing showed up. I mean, are we seeing a systemic failure in terms of prevention, control, and prediction policies?
Well, if you're talking about any kind of gun control, the system is a total failure. And the repeal of the Clinton era reforms, I mean, basically allowing them to die in the early years of the Bush administration, was the last chance. But really, I mean, first, the system is flawed. The system of checks is flawed. Secondly, even if it worked the way it was supposed to work, it still wouldn't do very much, because there are people who have warrants for domestic abuse. I mean, there are people who have severe mental problems who wouldn't show up on the list. And the problem really is not only that, it's people who are eligible to buy guns who shouldn't get them. So I think we have a problem of the system being broken, but the system also is in need of massive overhaul if we're going to make any kind of progress whatsoever in preventing gun violence in general, and specifically mass shootings.
Ray, what do you see as the main reason or the main reasons why America's gun control policies cannot make substantial progress over the years? We've seen Sandy Hook, we've seen the Colorado theater shooting. On both occasions, I was there as a correspondent, sadly and tragically. Why do you think this is the case?
Social infrastructure institutions are failing Americans. One way that social infrastructures are failing Americans, just for example, wages during the Great Depression were approximately 22% of the cost of a house. Wages right now for the United States are approximately 14% of the cost of a house. That means that for a given dollar, American worker is producing just as much, if not more, but is getting less of it. Keep in mind, meanwhile, we're seeing highly unlikely and unusual inflation costs right now, because we're being told time and again, there's too much money in our economy. Yet for the average American worker of any walk of life, particularly for those who are people of color in the United States, however, that dollar isn't going as far, and they're not seeing it in their community. All of these places where we are told are supposed to be bedrocks of our society and function are not functioning as such. And lastly, the origins of the Second Amendment come at a time where, one, there was an incentivized class looking to engage the Western frontier, a frontier that was at that time presumed to be untapped and untamed, and there was all sorts of unprecedented danger from person and animal there. And finally, we'd be remiss to ignore the ever-present threat of enslaved Africans rebelling and revolting. So there was a need to have an apparatus of the state in order to engage and put down that revolt. Fast forward to 2022, so many people who don't have those same needs are responding to the issues of their day with that logic. And we see that logic cannot sustain.
Right. William, can you maybe educate our audience around the world who are not necessarily inside the United States? Why is it so difficult for Washington to implement, to have any common sense gun control measures in place in light of all the mass shootings over and over and over again?
I think our question really has the essence of the answer, which is the United States federal government has no role in controlling guns. These are state and local legislations. These are state and local rights that the Constitution has guaranteed on an individual basis. It's not the military that is allowed to have guns, but the Supreme Court has interpreted the Second Amendment and the 14th Amendment as meaning these are individual rights. And I think the historical narrative of protecting yourself against opposing forces and invasion is an interesting narrative. But right now, going forward in the United States today, in the 21st century, the need for carrying arms and the need for self-defense comes about in part because the police force has not been able to assure the safety of individual citizens. And I think the large parts of the country, there's a need for the self-defense. And I think that's the basis in which people have been so adamant about the right to carry arms. Now, when you live in an urban center with millions of people into a few square miles, that becomes a very dangerous situation when people's tempers start to flare. And again, flaring because they feel that they are not getting ahead and other people are. And a bunch of crazies, whether it's schizophrenics or people of violence, start to decide, well, I'm going to take what it is that I can't get from you because you have it. That becomes a lack of law. It becomes a state of lawlessness that in some ways our police force has not been able to protect us from. And I think that's the protection I think that the Second Amendment people want to ensure. But that doesn't justify my taking a gun and shooting somebody just because I don't like the way they look. So the individual behavior, individual responsibility is something that we need to reinforce. And that's done at the family level, at the individual level, and group in a group level at churches and in other moral society, social institutions.
I mean, Rick, why is gun control such a polarizing issue in the United States? We've heard from the pro-gun groups, the anti-gun groups engaging in an ever-fierce battle, a war of words, if you like.
Let me look at it two ways. The first I want to talk about is social, deep within the fabric of the American character. There's a deep division. Yes, 40% of American households have weapons, but that means most don't. Well, I mean, my family is an example of it. I grew up in Philadelphia. Guns to me were instruments of death. I mean, the only times I knew of the use of guns were an accident where the brother of a classmate of mine in elementary school was killed playing with a gun, a loose gun, and the father of one of my classmates who was a businessman, and he was gunned down in a robbery in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. I saw that as instruments of death. My wife grew up in rural Texas. Her father took her hunting before she even was a teenager, so she knew how to shoot a gun. She looked at it differently at that time. And I think there's a deep division in America between people who say this is part of our life and those who say this is an instrument of death. And we are all urban people who are on your panel today. And so there's a deep division there. So now let me turn that into the political. Especially the US Senate has much more power in rural states and heavily rural states. And because each state gets 2 senators, no matter how many people they have in them. So it is very hard also because of the rules of the Senate. You have to get 60 votes to pass social legislation. Fiscal legislation you can do with 50 votes. So it's very, very hard to do it. And we have seen since the 1990s, no appetite, no matter how horrific the mass murders are, for that to happen. Add it, one more thing I will say is it's partisan issue, where all Republicans in the Senate are against change. Several would be in favor of several small reforms in terms of background checks, but not real gun control. And some moderate Democrats vote with the Republicans. So it's a problem of American democracy, the way representation is, and the fact that Republicans will not allow any kind of major change to the system.
Ray, how do you look at the politicization of the gun issues? Why is gun control such a polarizing issue, fracturing the US society?
I think it's interesting that we even reference the US, because at so many different important issues in the United States' history, these states of America have not been united. I appreciate what we heard just now from another one of our panelists that demonstrated the difference between the sentiments of those in urban settings versus those in rural settings. And I would also invite us to consider those may be in suburban settings. Also invite us to consider, as another panelist alluded to, how the church plays a role in the moral persuasion. So when you ask why is the United States so deeply divided, it's because the United States has always been so deeply divided in the history of this country on major issues that help define and shape a society. And so the gun issue only stands up in this moment at this time because with one negative decision, with one person impulsively behaving, now we can lose, as we saw in Buffalo, 10 lives at one time, or in Sandy Hook, 26 different people. And so what we're seeing is that this issue of division in the United States is not singular to the question of guns. It's not singular to the question of abortion. It's not singular to a lot of these questions that so often in the United States, we want to reduce it to an either or. It is because it is a broad amalgamation of people who come together for different purpose and different interests and are motivated and incentivized oftentimes by competing ideas. And when you find folks that are incentivized by competing ideas, then of course there will be deep political differences and divisions. And what's worse, when we have an attitude and aptitude for violence as a mode of communication, that division will manifest itself and those folks will talk to each other through violence.
Right. Well, William, let me turn to you. We remember former President Barack Obama's tears after Sandy Hook, when dozens of primary school kids died. I was there tragically, seeing all those grieving parents, very sad occasion. President Joe Biden announced packages of executive orders aiming to reduce gun violence. Do you think that will show in the numbers? Do you think Joe Biden's measures might work?
Well, I think we should also get a perspective on the number of violent crimes that have been committed with guns. Yes, there's now more of that than ever before, but there are more people in the United States than ever before. So, but if you scale it by the population, we have about 12 to 13 deaths caused by guns, suicide, murder, and other motivations for these crimes, but is well below where it was back in 1974, where it was 16. It's well below what it is in Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, where the numbers are 25 to 35 per 100,000. So yes, the United States has a lot of violence. Does it have more than other countries per capita? No, absolutely not. But that's not something to stand proudly on. We have to do something to get the numbers down. And you're absolutely right. The gun control laws and calls for gun control have not been successful in doing so. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what can reduce the violence within American society? Professor Baker has talked a lot about the historical experience, historical narratives that seem to go in a direction that is almost a sense of hopelessness. And Professor Dunham has also talked about how different perspectives in our country, right, make it so that it's so difficult to come together. So it comes down to the sense of individual responsibility and having people come to the sense that you don't resort to violence to solve your problems. And you certainly don't use a gun as an instrument to solve your problems. You solve your problems by bolstering their social economic institutions, improving the economy, getting your income up, getting productivity up, invest in people so that they can have a better job, better lives, so they don't have to resort to violence. Those are the solutions that we should be shooting for, not calls for more legislation for gun control or weapons control or cartridge control. These are again, addressing the symptoms when the root causes really have to be addressed. And both professors have talked about how deep the divisions are in our society, but not just the United States, but around the world. But yet somehow the United States is one of the highest violent countries in the world, not the highest, but one of the highest.
Rake, I saw you nodding your head. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One of the things that becomes challenging really quick is that so many Americans are not naive or are not silly or stupid, to be quite honest. It's difficult for the United States, particularly for leaders from our Senate, from our presidency or wherever, to say that our most effective way to solve discrepancies is through diplomatic essence when we're a country that's been at war in one way or another for more than 75% of our existence. And so while I actually agree wholeheartedly that that is the most effective way, all of the solutions to prop up the welfare of the individual, because what we know, particularly working in a community around anti-gun intra-communal violence, as I do, is that we try to prevent gun violence on the front end by taking away the need to incentivize that. And so I believe, and forgive me for speaking out of turn for the other panelists, but I imagine we're all in agreement on the solutions on how to get there. One of the challenges, however, is when our national character and behavior is different than what as we try to entice our individuals to be, there will be that tension there, and we'll have a difficulty resolving that tension. More plainly, we will be like the parent who tells the child not to eat the sugar, and yet when the child looks away, we go and quickly eat our favorite sugars.
Well, Rick, anything to add?
I think one problem is the ready access to guns. I mean, there are more guns out there than ever before, and as we've said before, there are almost no controls. So one would be limits, whether it's a waiting period or other things could be done to slow down the sales. Also, there are things that can be done. I say somewhat at the margins. I think one of the issues that we have to worry about is that there is less overall violent crime in America than 40 years ago, than 30 years ago. But this ready access has meant mass murder. And specifically, one change that I have seen in recent years is what I would call hate crime. People targeting groups, and a lot of it is racist. I mean, a lot of it is aimed at Black Americans. If you look in Atlanta, the killings of Asian Americans in some of the parlors last year. And that is a real problem, I think, of extremists who have access to guns, who believe that it is not only their right, but that they are protecting the American way of life against them, against the others. That's a lot harder to deal with. So the last thing I would say is there has to be a disincentive for the gun lobby, for gun manufacturers, and this is highly unlikely it would happen anytime soon, but some sort of liability if their weapons are used. And I mean, that would be a severe disincentive for them to try to continue to increase gun sales. So I mean, we could come up with a plan, but could we get it through Congress? Could we get it through the U.S. Supreme Court? That's the problem.
William, you are shaking your head.
Respectfully, I disagree strongly with what Rick just said. I think by having control over the legal sale of guns, you just drive it underground. I think the way to go is probably do what we did with marijuana, legalize it, but control it and license it. Put it in a place where you can know who it is that's buying stuff and how it is that they're buying it. And that way it becomes fully transparent where the guns are, who's using them, and who's responsible for the misuse of those guns. But once you drive it underground, you lose that transparency, you lose visibility, and you lose the ability of law enforcement to be able to do something about it. So I think it's a total mistake to go strongly toward the control the sales. Every gun store, it's got to require a 2-week waiting period, and then after that, it's get a 4-week waiting period before the gun's delivered to you. Then the criminal is just going to go and get the gun from the guy around the corner.
Rick, isn't there some truth to what William has said?
Yes, and in fact, I mean, if we could change the world, that would be a better answer. But the idea of the government knowing of all the guns, the big brother argument, is one that makes it a political non-starter. Personally, I think that would be a massive improvement on what we have now, and it would make a huge difference if the government knows. I mean, when my wife and I bought a cleaver for cooking in Beijing, and when we wanted to cook Chinese food in our kitchen, you had to register because it was considered a dangerous weapon. In the United States, that would be considered un-American to do that. I mean, with a cleaver, but with a gun, and so it would be a real political challenge. But yes, I mean, I agree completely. That would be a more effective way than anything I talked about. I'm just trying to figure out something that would be within the realm of possibility. But yes, I mean, in a perfect world, we would know where everything is, and be able to track weapons of death.
I mean, Ray, help us understand how deeply entrenched those opinions of gun possession, gun ownership are in the United States. We travel to, for example, Tennessee, or to the Christian Belt, or to many rural areas of the United States. People think they have a natural, God-given right to possess a gun.
Well, and also in many of the urban settings, we heard our professor earlier talk about how in urban settings, densely populated communities want to hold weaponry because they feel as though law enforcement doesn't do an effective enough job to protect them. I think that invites us to investigate what the purpose of our police force here in the United States serves as, whether or not it's public safety, as the PR campaign of the LAPD in the 1960s would suggest, or if it's in fact law enforcement, which is something considerably different. Different question, different show. I'll come back for that one too. This question, however, is specific around the idea of why do Americans hold so deeply to this need to have a gun? Americans have a belief in a concept of freedom that is not universally defined by every American. Let's revisit the idea of United States. Well, it's not completely united. What one person's perception of freedom is, someone else looks at as an invalidation of their individual freedoms. It's because the Enlightenment philosophies of those like John Locke and Rousseau and others are not universally agreed upon here in the United States as ways of being. Broad human individual rights, yes, so many Americans overwhelmingly agree to it. But if you poll 100 Americans from different parts of this very great empire, what does it mean to be free? It's a very good chance you'll get less than 50% as your plurality. And so what I think that invites us to ask is, when we ask about what an individual can possess because they are a free person to have a possession, whether or not a weapon is something that is morally right or consistent with our values, we have to consider this is also the nation where people made justification of owning and possessing people. And so, of course, there's going to be a space where someone was going to say, well, it's my freedom, right? Even those who may not want to have a gun in their home themselves, those who also agree that guns are weapons of harm would say, I cannot let someone come and take someone else's gun because that's an infringement on my concept of freedom in the way that I don't want it applied to me and something else that I may enjoy. And so, so long as there are so many Americans that have so many different understandings of one word, then it's difficult to create public policy that attends to the needs of the largest group of people, because we all have a fundamental difference in our understanding of what words mean.
Yeah, consensus is a rare commodity these days in the United States and in many societies as well. Ray Baker, thank you very much. William Lee, thank you. And Rick Dunham, thank you as always. Great to have you with us, gentlemen. We learned a lot. Thank you. That will do it for this edition of The Hub. Thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. I'll see you next time.